Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for having me, and thanks to the organizers. This has been really an exceptional exchange. And I brought a project that is an important cautionary tale, really, of how green industrial policy efforts can go sideways, focusing on the case of Hungary, the front runner of battery production in the European Union, really showing how this whole thing looks like on the ground, and then really contrasting it to EU level goals and ambitions. I am a political scientist working at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, but I also have a parallel life as an opposition activist and political advisor in Hungary. And this is a story I've been following from the ground. And I wanted to start with a bit of context into the Hungarian case. So this is Hungary's autocratic leader, Viktor Orbán, in the summer of 2022, proclaiming that we, Hungary, will soon become the world's third largest battery manufacturer. Nobody picked up on it because this was also the speech where he lashed out against race mixing in Europe, and everybody kind of focused on that. But just think about what he said there. Tiny Hungary, aiming for third place in battery manufacturing after China and the United States, but competing with Germany, even though the German economy is 23 times as large. But it is happening. Right now, Hungary is number 4 worldwide and supports 1/4 of the EU's battery manufacturing capacities, and there's much more coming. Chinese battery giant CATL is building a gigafactory. Now, it is really hard to convey just how much this issue is talked about in our country. Last year, Battery Factory was chosen Word of the Year in a newspaper, and I bought a couple of news headlines translated first. Should we be afraid of being poisoned by battery factories? Then there's an economist asking, why does an energy-poor country want to become an energy-consuming battery superpower while using Hungarian taxpayer money to create jobs for Asian guest workers, ? And on the pro-Orbán side of things, Hungary is a great power, praised and envied by Western Europe. But back to the naysayers, what exactly is their problem? Hungary is, of course, deeply embedded in these German automotive value chains. Decarbonization is important, so it could be a sensible strategy. But the problem is the scale of it all and the way it is done. And if we consider the economic logic, it's really baffling, this mono-focus of an industry without having the energy, the water, and the labor force, so basically everything that is needed for this industry. And I know the language of comparative advantages is kind of outdated now that industrial policy is back, but I'm still wondering, should we throw it all the way out the window still? And the memories it triggers in Hungary are Soviet-era forced industrialization and these pipe dreams to turn the country into the land of iron and steel, which never happened, of course. Now, a really concerning part of the story is the ecological devastation this breakneck rollout of the industry brought about. There is a relentless stream of news reports about ecological and health damage and labor rights violations. There have been several deadly workplace accidents, fires, hazardous materials stored improperly, toxic chemicals found in groundwater, and a lot more. And keep in mind that this is an autocratic context, so information is not free. There must be also a lot that we don't know. And authorities are unable, and in many cases unwilling, to keep this in check. And what we're talking about here is a systematic strategy of attracting investments by relaxing environmental regulations. What you see there is a special economic zone drawn up for one of the gigafactories. The government basically told the mayor that this blue thing that you see there, the factory, is not part of your municipality anymore. It's not yours to tax and regulate. And there is extreme anxiety in local communities around this. What you see there is a public hearing which descended into chaos and fistfights. Local communities try to push back, and the response by the regime is tightening the screws of autocratic repression, so crushing dissent. But there is one supporter of these battery ambitions, and that is the European Union. And that's what's the focus of my paper. That's what kept me thinking. Europe has forged a more active industrial policy strategy. Professor Kate McNamara has talked about it and written about it. It follows geostrategic goals, and the EU Commission's battery czar, Maroš Šefčovič, praised Hungary's contribution to Europe's strategic autonomies through this battery industry strategy. Now, the 3 goals Europe follows in battery policy. The objective why we want to have a battery industry in Europe in the first place, as opposed to relying on imports, are first climate, then strategic autonomy and industry promotion. And what this paper looks at is whether and under what conditions does the battery industry, the real existing battery industry on the ground, serve these goals. And the paper also shows that while these goals are often portrayed as complementary by policymakers, they are not complementary. There are really harsh trade-offs between these objectives. So we also want to assess, okay, what is the hierarchy between these goals? And to skip ahead, I will find that it is the third, promoting industry and jobs, that seems to be the one trumping all the others. And I use qualitative case studies beyond the Hungarian case. I also look at the German battery strategy, and as a snapshot, also Sweden. Now, the case itself is linked to several interesting discussions in the literature. First of all, it shows that decarbonizable sectors can and do drive the clean tech revolution, but also shows that there are trade-offs involved with trusting the car industry with our green future. Then again, there are excellent contributions highlighting the EU's geoeconomic turn, but again, this case is a reminder that some of the EU's commitment are actually discursive fluff, and if we look at developments on the ground, they really start to ring hollow. And because what's happening here is the EU wanting to decrease dependence on autocratic powers by relying on an autocratic member state, I also want to show these contradictions there. So we want to break free of China and reduce reliance on Russia and rely on Viktor Orbán's Hungary in the process, the closest ally of Russia and China in the European Union. There's something off here. Now, the context of it all and the urgency, the source of the urgency is the global battery race, which I do not like to call a global battery race. It's a landslide victory for China. But the EU is committed to roll out the industry and have batteries produced in the US. So, yeah, we want to catch up with China. And what does this rollout look like in numbers? The blue bars are planned capacities by the year 2030. These are based on gigafactory projects that have been announced. Again, there's a commitment to cover the needs of EU-based industry. Already you see significant variation. So, and I put that in the context of projected demand. So the pink bars, they estimate the European industry's needs, and I just use a very quick back-of-the-envelope calculation here. I take the number of motor vehicles produced in the bloc in 2022, and I multiply it with an average battery size estimated by the International Energy Agency. And we've got the biggest car producer, Germany, for instance, producing 3.7 million vehicles in 2022. And their ambition, if they do not want to shrink their industry and they do not want to rely on imports, they need a capacity of about 300 gigawatt hours. And there are two countries with really outstanding ambitions. Hungary with 600% of demand capacity ratio, and Sweden with 700%, and Germany, of course, the largest in absolute terms. What I also look at are the patterns of ownership, basically company headquarters across these plans. And here we also see significant variation. We've got Sweden, for instance, with 100% domestic firms and 0% domestic in Hungary, Poland, and Portugal. And now, from both from a growth perspective and a strategic autonomy perspective, ownership profiles, of course, matter a lot. My question here is really, is the more high value-added part of the value chain in Europe, or is it elsewhere? Are company profits in Europe? And then there's the strategic autonomy question. We see that both Hungary and Germany are in large part reliant on China here. And if the question is, do we really increase Europe's strategic independence if the same Chinese company is physically producing in Europe? If the concern is that they want to have a less remote producer. Yes, it is a more secure supplier, but if the concern is a potential political fallout, then we're not really better off. But I think it's really insightful that we heard it yesterday that we are in a Cold War with China, and what Germany is doing, it really shows that they do not think in these terms. They do not subscribe to this point of view. They rely in large part on China. They have a different understanding of supply security, a less geopolitical one, I would argue. Now, given what I have showed you, let's see one by one if these three objections of the European Union in battery strategy are met by developments on the ground. So climate, strategic autonomy, and industry promotion. And then again, which is the one which gets prioritized. So climate first. Actually, at this point, from the climate perspective, the most expedient way to decarbonize would be to rely on imports. I think it's really clear. As I said, it's not a battery race anymore. It's a landslide victory for China, but the EU still says, okay, but this foreign production may not meet our EU-based ambitions because it's dirtier. But what the Hungarian experience shows, of course, that EU-based production will not be automatically greener. The industry is extremely energy intensive and extremely water intensive, and when it comes to climate, it really matters where the energy is coming from. And in the Hungarian case, it will come from Russian fossil fuels. So the overall climate impact is something that the EU should look at, and it also pledged to look at it. The problem will really be whether the EU can credibly enforce these rules. Now, water use is causing extreme anxieties on the ground. Also in the case of the German Tesla plant being built in Brandenburg. And I already told you about this. What we see in Hungary is an explicit strategy attracting investment by relaxing environmental regulations. So the overall climate impact of this story is questionable, and climate does not seem to be the driving priority here. Now, turning to strategic autonomy, this is also something I mentioned already. It's contradictory that we want to reduce reliance on China by relying on Chinese FDI. But we do see that both the German and the Hungarian strategy is building on Chinese FDI. And there is also another part of the strategic autonomy question that is a paradox from the EU's perspective. The EU wants to reduce exposure from authoritarian third countries, but then relies on an authoritarian member state to do so. And it is quite clear that it is not a growth strategy for Hungary. The motivation for this seems to be a political endeavor, a way to seek leverage in a key value chain, basically have it concentrated in Hungary, to wield it as a political weapon, potentially. If a key part of this value chain concentrates under Hungarian jurisdiction, then these German companies will be dependent on Hungary for supply. And this opens the door to leverage the value chain. And this is really something that the European Union seems to be not that aware of. So all in all, I'm concluding that strategic autonomy from the EU's perspective does not seem to be a guiding concern here. And finally, the economic reasoning. The battery industry is seen as a growth engine, but domestic value added really matters here. That's why I showed you that chart with the ownership or company headquarters profiles. If we only have the assembly line in Europe with little domestic value added, then that's not going to be a growth engine. Now, the optimistic scenario is that because China and South Korea are so far ahead, we just have their assembly lines here and throw our engineers on the shop floor, and that can create innovation spillovers, and that would be a good upgrading strategy. Now, this upgrading strategy in the Hungarian case, I believe, is way too optimistic. There is a shortage of engineers, a severely defunded education sector, so I just do not see that happening. And also in the German case, where it's, I think, more likely and the more sensible expectation, it's not going to happen automatically. So they will also need to somehow do proactive steps to upgrade, and these investors are actually known for tightly guarding technology and FDI. So it's also not automatic that it will happen, but it certainly has higher chance in the core in Germany than on the periphery. And finally, the overriding EU objective really, that trumps everything, it really seems to be jobs. There's this scrambling for manufacturing employment. Europe is really concerned about deindustrialization, and I believe that's really the dominant reason for these efforts to have a better industry on the continent. Now, I also wanted to just have a snapshot of an alternative path, the Swedish case, which is on paper a very well thought out strategy, actually. They have a national champion, Northvolt, under domestic ownership, so research and development also happen locally at the more high value added parts of the value chain. There's local access to raw materials, and they pledge to use 100% renewables for production. And Sweden also has a cold climate, which reduces this extensive cooling in battery production, so leads to lower water usage. But what we also see from recent developments is that it's not going very well right now. As I said, China and South Korea are really far, far ahead of Europeans in technology. Northvolt just lost a $2 billion contract from BMW, and what we see from BMW is that they're more aligning themselves with Hungary, and these batteries are presumably going to be produced in Hungary instead. So this really shows us that these trade-offs are really real. They are very harsh, and it really matters how policymakers navigate these trade-offs. It's just difficult to do battery production in a way that is also environmentally sustainable. And this is basically the conclusion that I wanted to leave you with. We need to be just much more honest about how to navigate these trade-offs and what these trade-offs actually entail if we want to pursue climate neutrality, strategic autonomy, and industry and jobs all at the same time. Sometimes we need to pick from these priorities. Sometimes we need to have a hierarchy between these priorities, and that's why democratic scrutiny is extremely important, so that we can actually inform the public about what exactly these trade-offs and these hard choices actually are. As I said, the EU is actually committed to look at the entire carbon footprint of battery production. So the fact that the Hungarian production seems to be banking on Russian fossil fuels may not be that good of a strategy. But then again, EU enforcement, we know, is really weak. And we have great research by Daniel Kelemen and others who show that it is actually becoming weaker and weaker. So it will be really key whether the EU can enforce the strict regulations. And then there is this quite paradoxical development. The EU's new geopolitical industrial policy strategy seems to be blind to the leverage risk that is posed by an autocratic member state, and by pursuing strategic autonomy and wanting to be more independent from, say, China, it reproduces this dependence within its own borders. And I believe this is a concern that they should be much more aware of. Thanks.
Fantastic questions. Oh, Joe here, and then let's take some in the middle.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I guess three comments. First, on ownership, a part of the doctrine of the old neoliberal world was ownership didn't matter, and they encouraged free flow of capital, and you've emphasized that ownership does matter. And I just ask you to try to delineate a little more. If the plants are already in Europe, and there's been enough transfer of technology so Europeans can manage them on their own, if there were a conflict, we could just, Europe could just say, well, it's too bad that you thought you owned it. We own it now. So plants that are constructed in other countries, ownership is always tenuous in the moment of a conflict. But ownership does have implications for transfer of technology, and one of the U.S. has complained about the transfer of technology from Western companies to China, and it seems that this, by having joint ventures, for instance, this will be going the other way. And I wonder whether China will be complaining about the transfer of technology to the West. So anyway, it's just an interesting reversal. The second point, just to emphasize that the objective of jobs is a macroeconomic objective, and that shouldn't be on that list. I know it is, but we should think about that as macroeconomics and not industrial policy. It's only when there are spillovers or other arguments that make it go in. And the third thing is on your last story about how Sweden was seems to be disadvantaged, and it just raises the question that you raised at the end, that if this is an environmental issue, it ought to be enforced throughout the EU, and to have one environmental standard for Hungary and another one for Sweden is clearly going to be creating large distortions. And I don't understand why Sweden didn't make more noise in the EU and say you can't steal our jobs by having dirty Russian gas in the middle of the Ukraine war.
Absolutely. All excellent points. So first about expropriating these factories. So let's put like a doomsday scenario in words. China invades Taiwan, and the EU is then prompted to have sanctions. Do we really believe that Viktor Orban will then nationalize or expropriate these companies? So what are the chances of that happening? And that's why it matters that in the EU's friend-shoring efforts, they should be they should really see who their friends really are. And Orban's Hungary is not their friend when it comes to actually punishing China in the middle of a geopolitical conflict. And when it comes to Germany, I'm also a bit reluctant to believe that they would go as far as to nationalize a Chinese company, given that they're also really reluctant to seize Russian assets. They have this really strong commitment to rules-based international trade. So yeah, and the reason I'm so focused on ownership, even though ownership is of course really complicated and it's a complicated question about control, but it's really a proxy for me whether or not the high value-added part of the value chain is in Europe or elsewhere. And we saw that on the European periphery that, economists talk of the middle income trap, how the European periphery really stuck in these assembly line model and never really managed to upgrade. So that's why I focus on ownership. Your point about jobs as a macroeconomic objective and not really an industrial policy objective is very well taken, and it also links back to something that Professor Roderick talked about yesterday. That we want to promote industrial jobs in Europe, and the car industry is this huge employer. But are these good jobs? Are these 3-shift assembly line jobs in these battery companies the types of jobs that we want to promote if we are spending all that money through subsidies to create the jobs? And the lack of conditionalities or guarantees that these will indeed be good jobs is also questionable. And your point about Sweden and the puzzling lack of questions they asked in this case is something that I think will come out at one point. But we also have to see that the EU, it took the EU a decade to do anything about democratic backsliding in Hungary, and there's a big reluctancy to really intervene in a forceful way in these cases. And I think this is what Orbán is banking on, that it will just be too important for the German car industry, and these commitments will then not be credible and not enforced.
Great. So have 2 more minutes to help her, please.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this job question because I guess I agree maybe job quantity should be macro, but I think about job quality as something that's an appropriate subject for industrial strategy in the sense that you can to get really good jobs, you need to operate on the demand and the supply side. And I think we're seeing in the US, there's a couple different ways to do batteries. You can have workers that are very unskilled, they're sort of watching production, or you could actually have them, monitor the sensors. They're the ones that do the first line response, in the higher end. But to do that, you have to train the workers. So they need a supply side policy, but then you need some demand for those workers, and it doesn't work unless you really have both of those together. So I guess wondering about that, and it seems like it's possible that those could be good jobs, but it takes that kind of policy. More likely to see it in Sweden. So.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it all comes down to whether or not these labor regulations are there in the first place and whether or not they are enforced. The case I showed you about the special economic zone and how labor regulations are significantly relaxed is certainly, an example where this doesn't happen. And then, but then we also see unions, for instance, Germany's IG Metall, really supporting having these gigafactories in Germany. They're also just afraid that these manufacturing jobs will go away, and they want to have the battery jobs instead. So exactly. I mean, but then again, as you said, it will all come down to the regulation and the credible enforcement of the regulation also.
Cool. Can continue the conversation offline. Thank you very much, the speakers. Thank you, everyone.